you look back in history, and this is part of what I talk about in the Midnight Kingdom, you see these moments where all of a sudden everything changes. And during the age of industrialization, you have to have, railroads. All of a sudden you're using oil, you're building these big giant cities and factories. A very, very small group of people make incredible fortunes. And once you reach a certain point of wealth, like there's nothing else to buy except for the government. And you start buying the government more and more and more. And then eventually you look up and you're like, representative democracy is a problem.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And it is a Facebook Live event. It goes to YouTube after that. It then becomes a podcast and can be found everywhere podcasts are found and/or listened to. And if you like it, please share the links to this conversation and other conversations in any way you can, and also like it in the web sense and let people know about it. My guest today is someone I've talked to before here on my In Conversation podcast, and that is an author and someone who I have very high regard for, and that is Jared Yates Sexton. He has a large online following. He is a writer, he teaches, he lectures, he speaks. And his forthcoming book, which we'll jump to before talking about the book that's out already, is The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis, which seems to be upon us right now, other than coming. And then the book that's out now is American Rule, The Man They Wanted Me to Be. And we'll talk about both of those projects. And Jared, one thing I wanted to do now is jump to a tweet you posted this morning and one I posted too, to sort of frame our conversation. Here's what you just tweeted. Forgive me for reading off the screen here. With constant mass shootings and declining trust in institutions, authoritarians are gaining power by spreading conspiracy theories and promising to deliver order from chaos. We have to look at how this same playbook fascists always turn to. This is the same playbook fascists always turn to. And I tweeted moments later, could the left and right of the Democratic Party please agree that the next election is important enough that they need to work together and win? So I think that kind of bookends our little project of discussion here, because we both feel we're living at a very serious moment. I don't even know where to start. Let's begin with a little bit of personal history. Why do you and I understand each other so well? Why don't you start with yourself, and you can pull me in a way, kind of introduce me, and I'll introduce you a little bit. But let's just sort of kick back and forth why we get each other. Some of the context of our former discussions. You had mentioned a project, How Should We Then Live, a whole bunch of other stuff that I'd been involved with. I don't know where you want to start, but why don't you kick this off?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Frank. I always appreciate talking to people who, well, there's no other way to put it, who get it. In the past few years, we've been watching a gathering crisis that was pretty obvious for people like you and myself. I think we're able to speak the same sort of language because in a way I sort of grew up in the consequences of the project that you and your father had carried out, obviously. I grew up in an evangelical community that was absolutely riddled through with extremist ideology, latent white supremacy, conspiracy theories, apocalyptic narratives. And I grew up absolutely steeped in the idea that eventually we would reach a point of apocalyptic conditions in which America would be under attack by liberal forces, outside forces, internal traitors. All of this is part of a satanic scheme in order to attack both God and his chosen champion, the United States of America. It took me a long time to sort of come out from underneath that mythology, that narrative, which we need to talk about how that was constructed and what it does and what it entails and empowers. So we're able to understand that sort of worldview in a way that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people fail to. Leading up to 2016, with Donald Trump gaining the support of white evangelicals, I think we both looked around and we saw a lot of people saying, how could they support this guy? How could he possibly get the vote of evangelicals? Like, look at what they say they're about. Meanwhile, I think that we've seen up close the hypocrisy, the power mongering, the conspiracy theories, the fear mongering. And it made it very clear what was happening. And now we are living in a new era of crisis. A lot of different crises that are combining for a larger existential societal crisis. And to understand how we got here is to understand how these stories that you and I both were steeped in for a very long time, how they came to dominate culture and history, politics, economics, you name it, but also what the consequences of those things actually are.
Well, I'm going to jump in at an odd place. Because there's so many things we could do here, and we're going to take all the time we need, by the way. But let me jump in a strange place. You talked about something we saw coming. Back in the 1980s, I forget, let's just pick a date. Maybe it was 82, 83. My father's books were huge bestsellers in the evangelical market. We took a full-page ad out in the New York Times, which I think at the time we paid $60,000 for. Now it would be more, or perhaps less, because papers have diminished. But this is back in the good old days of print when it was everything. And the ad was, this book should have been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And that, I think, was his book, How Should We Then Live? Because in fact, numerically, we were outselling the book that was currently #1 on the New York Times bestseller list by 2 to 1. Okay, in hardcover. And this was back in the days when evangelicals weren't even on the radar. It was, Newsweek was the last American magazine to have a religion section. Time magazine didn't have one. The New York Times had a style section and a science section and all sorts of stuff, but not religion. Religious books were never reviewed because it was those people out there somewhere in the middle of the country that doesn't matter. Who knows what they're doing? They're even more irrelevant than the Rust Belt. I mean, I'm being facetious and nasty, but that's the truth. So the kind of East Coast snobbery kept book counts from bookstores and Christian bookstores and religious bookstores out. I can picture Hillary and Bill Clinton somewhere reading the New York Times and checking out the book review section of what's important in this country and what showed up on their radar. Yep. Never a religious book like How Should We Then Live, talking about how secular humanism was replacing Christianity. And then later, my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, calling evangelicals to armed insurrection unless Roe v. Wade could be overturned. None of this was on their radar screen. So I got on the Today Show with Jane Pauley, and she interviewed me and the head of the American Library Association, who was a more typical New York liberal in that mold back in my right-wing days, when I was an evangelical shill and a nepotistic sidekick to my father. And I argued a point which actually, even today, I would agree with. And that was, you should be including our books. Now it would have a very different spin to it. And I would be telling people, you have not paid attention to this world, and it has now eaten you alive. Because not only did what my dad called for come true on January 6th, a first step, but we're now facing not a Republican win, but a theocracy. If these people get their way, they've got a majority on the Supreme Court that has just knocked down Roe v. Wade. So we, quote unquote, speaking as my old self, won. They are getting ready to attack gay marriage and gay rights. Contraceptives are being challenged and already on the docket. We have them saying they're going to take a case to take another look at voter rules and gerrymandering and all the rest of it from the point of view of what Republicans want in state houses and so forth. So I'm going to come back to a question to you after my little rant here. What is the state of both secular media commentary and the academic community when it comes to at last noticing and deigning to comment upon the fact that there are tens of millions of evangelicals that have taken over the Republican Party, and yet that group of people on the left, or a more liberal point of view, still don't seem to be willing to take the time to understand who they are, what they want, and their own intellectual firepower. It's easy to call them all rubes, but they're still not dealing with the Francis Schaeffers of this world, or the G.K. Chestertons, or the Bill Buckleys who started National Review. That whole intellectual tradition, which is, because you came from that background, had real weight. and right now is dominating the Supreme Court of the United States through the Federalist Society and others. Okay, after a very long-winded thing there, I want you to have an equally long-winded response, because I think that must have triggered a lot of stuff in your head.
Oh, for sure. Well, I'll go ahead and start. I come from rural Indiana. I come from folks who worked in factories, who worked in mines, who, you know, were janitorial staff and prison guards, you name it. They are not rubes. And there is a classist view in this country that I think has actually undermined a lot of potential and actually done a lot of damage. I grew up in the 1980s. This is when, obviously, my family was starting to really get in deep into these religious narratives. And on the back of things like How Should We Then Live, were more apocalyptic conspiratorial sort of books and culture. This is right around the time where you start having the stirrings of like the New World Order conspiracy theory, right? The idea that a satanic conspiracy was going to overthrow America and turn everything into a one world government, which, by the way, is a leftover of communist fear-mongering of the Red Scare. Well, eventually what happens is as the rest of the country starts to move beyond those Rust Belt areas that you're talking about, including my small, idyllic, you know, hometown, all of a sudden the factories that my family is working in, the places where they're actually like able to afford homes, you know, with the salaries that they have, those things start going away, obviously, because of free trade and de-industrialization. My family didn't have the understanding of economics that a lot of these people we're talking about do. You know, people in Eastern and Western elite circles understand industrialization and economics and politics because they've gotten the educations that allow them to, because they are a managerial class that oversees all of this. They understand all of this. My family didn't know that. You know, they went to school, they were taught a very actually religious tinged education. You know, you look up to America, God is on our side. It's a very religious type of education. Meanwhile, their religious leaders are telling them this is a satanic plot. This is about the devil coming after you. This is about a sinful cabal of people who are coming after you. All of it very thinly veiled anti-Semitic, racist, white supremacist, fascist conspiracy theories. So what ends up happening is for literally decades, the people that you and I are talking about right now are not only overlooked ideologically, they're overlooked economically, politically, socially. There's a reason why the middle of America is in revolt against the coast, why the rural communities are in revolt to the urban communities. There's so much that goes into all of that. But if you really want to understand this, the people who are listening to this conversation, you need to understand that ideology is the story that you use to make sense of the world. All of the stuff that we're talking about is very complicated. And that's one of the reasons I'm always glad to have conversations like this, where we can get deep in the weeds and talk about what's actually happening on the ground. But the stuff that you were involved in and your father was involved in and the evangelical right was involved in is a story that goes over the top of all of it. It simplifies it. It's a concentrated version of this. And it's important to point out that those conspiracy theories, outsiders, internal traders, people of color who don't know any better and they're being manipulated, these secular humanists, all that idea, that is a transfer of blame. It takes the anger that my family and the people I care about who are pissed off about what's happened in this country and that they've been overlooked, it takes all of that anger and transfers it from the people who deserve it and transfers it over to their political enemies. And that's always been the case. So in all of this, what we're actually watching, and I know that people hear, you know, everything from QAnon to the big lie, and they're like, man, who could ever believe this crap? But while they're hearing all of that, they're discounting that it's cultural. It's ideology that these people have been steeped in for years and years and years. And I'm sitting here talking to you about this. And even as we're having a discussion, I know all of this. I've studied it. I've researched it. I'm able to have conversations with people like yourself who were on the ground floor for this stuff. And there's still a cultural gravity to it for me. It's almost impossible to escape. And even if you do, it's still, you know, it's still there because that worldview is powerful for a reason. And so we're literally talking about a group of people who are caught in an ideological narrative that explains things, but it's been weaponized by really dangerous people for political and economic purposes.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible response. Now, I've been so excited about having this conversation with you that I forgot to do the things that I'm supposed to do at the beginning of this. So let me take a time out. And when I come back, I'm going to ask you this question. And if I forget, Ernie, my redoubtable producer, has put a note in here to me, so I'll remember, but you can remind me too, Jared. And that is, I want to get to something here that I made a note on. We all underestimate the power of living in our own bubbles. And I think that cuts right and left. I don't think that's only, this. Okay, so I want to get back to that. But first of all, let me pretend this is the beginning of this episode again and say, Jared, tell me about yourself, because we've heard that you came on a journey. You knew who my dad was and what we were doing. Give me a little thumbnail sketch about yourself. Who are you? Where do you come from? What do you do on a daily basis? And give us 3 minutes about yourself so that we all know who you are, and do for me what I forgot to do 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, well, just real quick, because there's so much to get in the weeds with, and when it comes to talking to you, I always feel very fortunate that we can get into stuff that other people miss. So I come from this rural small town in Indiana. I come from factory people. I went to school and I studied writing, including creative writing, rhetoric, all of that stuff. I was writing short stories and novels. And then in 2015, 2016, I decided to start going to rallies for the upcoming presidential contest. I thought it was going to be so boring, Frank. I thought it was going to end up being Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton and just like the biggest snooze of an election ever. I ended up in the right place at the right time. I started going to Donald Trump rallies, and as people were dismissing him, they thought the system would spit him out. What I started recognizing was the exact same people that you and I are talking about right now were showing up at those rallies and having these conversations about these conspiracy theories, these ideas. They were starting to talk about violence. They were starting to talk about overturning, the institutions, all of this. I recognized very quickly, because these were my people, I recognized very quickly that the conversations my family was having behind closed doors had come out into the public arena, and that there was a movement that was growing, an authoritarian movement, a long time coming. Since 2016, the past 6 years, I have dedicated my life to understanding that, researching it that way, because I feel like I fell into the deep end of the pool. And as I fell into the deep end of the pool, I had to do the thing which I've always done, which is I had to educate myself. And as I've done that, and I've started making these connections, I have understood, as a lot of people already do, but unfortunately people like myself and where I come from don't, which is there's a deeper politics to politics. The conventional story and history that we're all taught is just a very simplified, but also weaponized history. And the more that I've come to understand, including your background, your father's background, and the efforts that you had, I've come to understand why I was raised the way that I was, why the ideology I had as a child was there. And basically, I've more or less dedicated myself to exposing it to other people and trying to tear it down.
I'll ask you one little footnotey question, and then we're going to get back to our deep into the weeds, as you put it, or whatever. How did it happen that you have such a following on Twitter and other social media venues? Because I'm always amazed. I see your tweets go up, and then minutes later, there's thousands of retweets and likes. What was the path? Because you didn't. Day one wasn't that way. Who are all these people who are following every word you write and with such respect, and your threads are always long and interesting and go back and forth? Just give me 30 seconds on that.
Well, so the whole thing started when I went to a Donald Trump rally in North Carolina. I believe it was Greensboro. I went in with, I want to say 1,800 followers. And, the story that I have is only possible in the social media age. And the reason why I think it happened, I've had a lot of time to really sit and think about it, was because everybody was dismissing Donald Trump as a lark. He was great for ratings. He was great for news profit, and nobody wanted to discuss what was actually happening in the crowd. So I had that background, and I think that hit with some people, and it hit some nerves, and it made them think, wow, these things I'm afraid of are actually like happening. And since then, I think I've developed the platform that I have simply because we all know that there's something bad going on, and attempts to dismiss it or, trying to tell people everything will be fine. We both know, and they all know, that isn't true, that there's a larger problem that we have to address here.
So, okay, now I want to get back to the main kind of topic of what we're talking about. And thank you for doing my job for me there. All the stuff I should have said about you at the beginning that I kind of already know, by the way. So, but yeah, I think you said it better. So this point of mine, we all underestimate the power of living in our bubbles. And let me interpret that both from the left or about the left and the right. I talked earlier at the beginning of this conversation about going to the Today Show with Jane Pauley, being interviewed about the fact the New York Times was not reviewing our books, let alone putting them on their bestseller list, because they totally ignored the evangelical market as if somehow it didn't exist. We might have been on the dark side of the moon.
I think, by the way, it's not just that it didn't exist, they looked down on it.
Oh, yeah, very much.
And I think that's the larger thing here. Yeah.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that New York Times bubble, pre-internet, pre-the web. We were already in bubbles. So, my agent on the Upper West Side reads the New York Times, let's say. She's never heard of any of these people either. I'm thinking of that period of time. It's a bubble. It's a kind of a snobbery and so forth and so on. Fast forward to the internet moment we're in now, and those bubbles have become almost absolute. And so here's what I think the downside of living in bubbles is, and there are many downsides, but let me name one. I think the left wing, the progressives, the Democrats I know, and that's top to bottom. I've met and talked with Nancy Pelosi. I know people all the way to just all the voters who are friends of mine in my neighborhood. Living in these bubbles, sort of concentric circles going out, protects you in a way that leads to your demise when you underestimate the power of your opposition. Yeah. They never understood how many evangelical voters were going to turn out for Trump, and those evangelicals, not the Russians, not the right-wing media. It was evangelicals who made him president in return for him saying to people like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham, "I will put the list of these judges into the Supreme Court if I'm elected, and onto the federal bench." It was a quid pro quo. All the way along the line, it was, we're paying for this bubble, because if you're living in a left-wing progressive bubble, you're always underestimating both the numbers, the power, and the intelligence of, because you were looking down on these people. I'm wondering now, as we face the midterms and then the next presidential election, if the left is still got a wildly inaccurate idea about what is actually out there in terms of what voters are really thinking about, as opposed to the talking points the left is thinking about.
Well, I think you and I disagree on our ideas on what left, center, and right are in this case. And that's understandable. I mean, these things are just completely subjective ideas, right? Yeah. And I will say very quickly that a large reason why the bubbles exist in the first place is because the system as it stands needs those bubbles in place. So like right now I'm an academic. I'm at a university. I'm a professor. I grew up working class. I do not feel comfortable within the academy. I'm with a lot of people who grew up with a lot more money than I did, and in a different sort of class than I did. So as a result, when I have conversations with other academics, they feel so far off base about what they think about my family, what my community was about. They do not understand these people. It is much easier in our current system to look at those people, Trump voters, evangelicals, you name it, and say, oh, they're just ignorant. They don't know what's going on. They kind of deserve their lot in life, which is a large problem in America right now. It's the idea that, oh, you're not doing well. Well, guess what? That's your fault. And by the way, that's the prosperity gospel that came as part of this ideological project we're talking about.
God will bless you if you do the right things.
Exactly. And this is even a secular idea. It does not have to be religious. Like, you have basically in America, you have a lot of different classes that look at each other and just absolutely either detest one another or think they're getting what they deserve, or they wish for what the other one has. That class problem is exacerbated by the fact that there is an incredibly wealthy group of powerful people. We're talking about the type of donors who are spreading these conspiracy theories.
Sure, and like the Mercers, for instance.
The Mercers, the Kochs, you name it. These people have an incredible constellation of think tanks, foundations, and organizations that use the conspiracy theories we're talking about. That religious ideology, that religious narrative. They use those things to protect themselves, to make more money, to eradicate government. They have just absolutely done an incredible job on this. So there is a lot of financial incentive to spread these conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
There is everything to gain from all Americans. Well, I guess it would be like 98% of the population realizing their lives are being made worse because of this, that they're making less money than they possibly could, that the system is collapsing because the situation is growing worse and worse and worse. Mm-hmm. You're not going to have clean air. You're not going to have clean water. On top of that, you're going to have guns everywhere. I mean, you name it. All of this is a result of that top-down operation. And the problem in all of this is that we can't keep going after each other. And as we're going after each other, we're actually carrying out the game plan of the people at the very, very top who use their money to divide us.
Would you say the people at the very, very top of the left and right, or just the right?
Well, so there's a couple of things happening with that as well. So on the right, so for instance, you already brought up the Federalist Society, right? Mm-hmm. They have pushed to take over the Supreme Court and the judiciary in order to dismantle the progress of the 20th century.
They've done that for almost 50 years, by the way.
Absolutely.
This is a long-term, keep your eye on the ball plan.
And by the way, they have completely lapped the Democratic Party multiple times. I mean, the Democratic Party has had no answer for this whatsoever.
Yes.
And meanwhile, something that has happened right around the time that you're talking about, like as Reagan is starting to rack up these giant electoral victories, the Democratic Party has a moment where they're like, we have to change. We have to be more like the Republican Party. So what do? They start courting corporate donors. They start courting what we would call the professional managerial class. Meanwhile, they're not worried about labor. They're not worried about minorities, vulnerable communities, you name it. So what ends up happening is that the government for the past few decades has been completely bought out by these wealthy interests. They have completely taken over our government, almost to a person, almost to an institution. And as that has happened, we have, as that pie continues to shrink and shrink and shrink, we're divided against each other constantly. So one of the things that is an absolute failure of the moment, and this is the Democratic Party, you can call it the left, you can call it whatever you want. I mean, the left has been effectively destroyed. If we're talking about where we are on the spectrum, everybody now is pitted against each other for who can get a piece of the increasingly shrinking pie. So we're having fights with one another about who deserves what or who deserves blame. And while that is happening, the people at the very, very top, they're growing their wealth. They're growing their power. And these conspiracy theories, this ideology we're talking about, is weaponized to keep us at each other's throats.
And weaponized, I may say, by people on the right, at least, who I know personally in some cases, who I also know don't believe the conspiracy theories they're peddling at all.
And there is a difference right now, and I try and explain this to people, because everybody looks at the Republican Party, and the old fashionable line is that they're more disciplined than the Democrats. That is true. But the Republican Party, as you know, has so many different factions to it now. I mean, you've got people who are absolute theocrats. I mean, Bill Barr, Pompeo, you name it. These are people who literally want there to be an orthodox religion.
Well, and I think Amy Coney Barrett was certainly raised to be one. She was raised in an evangelical cult, even more cultic and fundamentalist than the one I was raised in.
And what I keep telling people is there are true believers in the Republican Party that are just like, you're exactly right. Coney Barrett I
think she's one of them.
I do too. But there are plenty of people who look at this and they sneer at it, and they know it's ridiculous, but they know it's a lever. They know it's an incredible weapon that they can take out. Meanwhile, on the other side, one of the things that's been loosed in the last few years are absolute grifters. Just people who, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene would rather be on a reality TV show than be in the halls of government. So you have all these different groups. Plus now, if your listeners, I haven't heard you talk about this yet, but national conservatism, which has all the momentum in the world. This is the new thing that will probably take over the Republican Party in totality. This is a group who recognizes the usefulness of religious orthodoxy as a weapon. They recognize the use of conspiracy theories. And I have to tell you, they have some really disturbing ideas about what to do with the economy and culture and politics, including a total destruction of liberal democracy. So what we're actually talking about is a larger existential, societal, political threat. And meanwhile, so many people are getting lost in arguments that are designed to literally push us apart from one another. And those conspiracy theories and those arguments are designed, implemented, weaponized. They study this stuff. Those donors that we're talking about from the very top, the corporations, the corporate donors from the very, very top, they understand how powerful this stuff is. And as people start to lose more and more faith in our institutions, politicians, you name it, they need a new faith. And what's happening right now is a revival.
Let me interject a footnote, and then let's get back to what you were saying, because I don't want to derail your thought process here. But where does some of our newly tilting toward the right billionaire class fit in? The sort of Elon Musk, but also some of the others seem to be tilting towards the right, or at least to defend their own fortunes. You know, they're not the old school Mercer Koch fellas. This is a new breed, but they've got a lot of money. Just give us a little short.
Well, so the Kochs and the Mercers, it's actually kind of interesting to think about the Kochs and the Mercers almost as midwives, if you will. And so basically starting in the 1970s, and this again, use the Christian right in order to carry this out. In the 1970s, a bunch of wealthy Americans looked up. If anybody hasn't read it, you should read the Lewis Powell memo. I believe it's 71, which basically said that wealth and capitalism are under attack in America. The wealthy need to pool the resources and just basically create an alternate reality. That way they can deny everything from climate change to, reform movements. So as they do this, neoliberalism, which is pushed by Ronald Reagan, using evangelical Christianity, also the Bushes do this as well, basically deconstruct the regulatory state. They take away, they not only tax cuts, but all of a sudden you change everything about the law to benefit the wealthy. And in fact, they talk all the time about redistribution of wealth and how dangerous it is. It redistributes literally trillions of dollars from the bottom up. Right. And moves all that. And it creates, particularly in this new tech class.
And which the Supreme Court, by the way, just underlined with their anti-EPA ruling.
Oh, this is the death blow. What the Supreme Court is doing right now is a death blow after decades of this. So basically, after the brakes are taken off of our politics and allows people to accumulate unbelievable wealth, you have basically a new industrialization, but this time it's tech. So basically, if you look back in history, and this is part of what I talk about in the Midnight Kingdom, you see these moments where all of a sudden everything changes. And during the age of industrialization, you have to have, railroads. All of a sudden you're using oil, you're building these big giant cities and factories. A very, very small group of people make incredible fortunes. And once you reach a certain point of wealth, there's nothing else to buy except for the government. And you start buying the government more and more and more. And then eventually you look up and you're like, representative democracy is a problem. We can't have the regular people making choices. So There is this thing that happened. And this is one of the things that when we tell our stories about history, we miss. Fascism, Nazism, authoritarianism in the 20th century, it was bolstered by the robber barons who made their money off of industrialization.
Well, the same thing happened in Germany because it was Krupp and all these other guys that began to work with Hitler saying, we don't like him, he's an idiot, he's a rube, but we're going to use him because we've got too much chaos and he's going to guarantee us making a fortune. And all the way up until the end of the world, they were actually using slave labor and all the rest of it that's who Mercedes came from, by the way, and Volkswagen and Audi and Porsche as well. These companies are all still in existence, making billions now. And it's nice to remember they had that same beginning.
And it's nice to remember that as the Great Depression is happening, and I got to tell you, as our conditions get worse, we need to look at this period and understand what happened. Everybody now likes to tell the story that Franklin D. Roosevelt showed up and said, let's have a new deal, and everyone supported him. That's not what happened.
Yeah.
America's corporations and wealthy came out against him. In fact, they tried to carry out a coup. And eventually they pushed their money to Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, who, by the way, were completely lauded by everybody from the New York Times to the Washington Post.
Yeah.
So there are these moments of crisis. And when these crises happen, the wealthy and even the middle class a lot of the time, which unfortunately is what I think is happening right now, they look at the crisis and they say, man, I don't like the way these guys are doing things, but somebody needs to install some discipline, right? Somebody needs to protect my wealth, my property. And I got to tell you, these tech barons, they don't care about democracy. They see democracy as an outdated idea. They see the government as this old dinosaur that needs tech managers to come in and regulate it. They basically want an executive, which, a reminder, is what they thought Mussolini and Hitler were. They thought it was somebody who could come in with a strong hand and regulate these things. So right now, we're looking at a political system that's been completely bought. We're looking at a wealth class that is historically rich and powerful and has a surveillance state, the likes of which only reside in our nightmares. They have a new
a lot of the money they've made has come from creating technology that actually facilitates a surveillance state, which, by the way, is already being very effectively used all the way down to the last cell phone in China right now.
Absolutely.
So there's an authoritarian model / authoritarian fascist dictatorship already that is essentially taking all this technology and doing there what we will be doing here a few years from now if we stay on this path.
100%. And to go along with our conversation about religious ideology is the story that explains things. It's really important because everybody likes to tell the story about fascism and Nazism like, oh, they gave amazing speeches. And that's why people did it. No, what it was a religious revival. There was a moment when secular government and secular society started to lose its luster, and people lost faith in things. And people came along and they said, we're going to have a revival, much like, by the way, what the evangelical right and Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s. You come out and all of a sudden you reinstall religion. Nazism, a religion. Fascism, a religion, all of it tinged, by the way, with Christianity and the Christian narrative.
Well, and treat the existing old order religious figures very sympathetically.
Yes.
You invite the bishops to bless your stuff. The Lutheran church comes in. The evangelical churches come in Germany, etc. The French Roman Catholic Church, such as it was in France, goes with the collaborationist Vichy government. It's always the same relationship.
And so what ends up happening, and this is how this cycle continues. So, for instance, you want to talk about my family, who I'm sorry, they sacrificed their bodies in factories, right? My family sacrificed their bodies in factories and in their labor. One of the reasons they did it is because they had a religious belief. They believed that God was looking down and smiling on their efforts, right? They would be rewarded in heaven. And on top of that, they were doing it in service of America and its institutions. They might not have been aware of that, but that was the story that kept them going in and working for subpar labor.
Yes, slightly in the glow of Rosie the Riveter sort of removed.
Exactly. So what we're looking at now, and I want to make this very clear, America is in decline. And there's a lot of reasons why America is in decline. But one of the reasons is this system of globalism that's been set up, where we send our factories to Mexico or Vietnam or China or you name it. They're coming back around. And if you listen to these national conservatives, all they talk about is reindustrialization, getting people back in factories. That's going to require a religious narrative. That's going to take a religious revival, which is how you get that theocratic idea. And then all of a sudden, going back to the strong man you're talking about, these religious institutions who are all over this stuff. This is why Christian nationalism is on the rise. This is why radical Catholicism is on the rise. They are going to find, and it's probably not going to be Donald Trump. It's probably going to be somebody who is more ideological, more disciplined, more intelligent. They are going to say, restore order, and we will basically announce you as the third coming or second coming, or whatever we want to call it. And it's this idea that continues to perpetuate itself throughout history. It's so predictable that it's depressing.
Let me reintroduce you a second. This time I will do my job. I'm Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast, a Facebook Live event on YouTube, and where podcasts are found. And if you like it, please like it in the online sense of sharing it with people. My guest today is someone that I was very excited to talk to again, and that is Jared Yates Sexton, who's a professor, who's a historian, who's a social critic with a huge following out there, deservedly so, I may say. And he has a couple books that we are sort of touching on here. One is American Rule, The Man They Wanted Me to Be, and a forthcoming book with a title that sounds like it's ripped from the headlines, Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. So, Jared, let me ask you a couple of questions here, sort of zeroing in on a couple of points. Somewhere back in our conversation there, just this personal curiosity, you mentioned that you think that you and I see something about the right and left or their symbiotic relationship a little differently. A, what were you talking about? And B, correct what you think I've got wrong here, because I respect you enough to change my mind. I've changed my mind about a lot of shit in the past. I'll do it again. Just tell me what you're talking about.
Well, so when I look at the political spectrum, the way that I view it is that, and your listeners probably have heard this term before, the Overton window, right? The Overton window is this idea that, like, the idea of what's acceptable or what reality is moves from time to time. Sure. And by the way, a quick side note, for people who think, my God, we're not going to have a theocracy or fascism in America, the Overton window moves fast. And I want to point out that the overturn of Roe v. Wade, everybody listening, you may have hopes that there will be an answer for it. Something inside of you has to tell you, we're being prepared to live with this.
Yeah. And by the way, let me just interject, and do not let me once again derail what you are about to say. No. For people who are listening who don't know me, Frank Schaeffer, Jared is kind enough to talk about me as if somehow you're all aware of who I am. But let's just say for a minute, there's a few of you who don't know my history. Aside from the fact I'm a writer of fiction and nonfiction, and have been married for 52 years, by the way, and take care of my 5 grandchildren as best I can, 3 of them who live nearby. Who I am is someone who in the 1970s was the nepotistic shill and sidekick to a famous evangelist father, Francis Schaeffer, who many historians like Jared will say, without whom the symbiotic relationship of the pro-life movement, as it was a Roman Catholic thing at that time, would not have developed as closely with evangelicals, who a lot of them were pro-choice by at that time, by the way, including Dr. Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist, and Criswell of the Southern Baptists, who ran that organization at that time. Here's the preamble. That was the preamble. What we outlined in our private meetings, when Jerry Falwell and my father sat down together, when Pat Robertson and my dad sat down, when Dr. Dobson gave away 250,000 copies of a book I wrote called A Time for Anger, a kind of an evangelical call to arms, when they discussed my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, the program they laid out, as in what we need to do, as my father would say in Christian colleges, don't become a missionary, don't become a pastor, go to law school, become a lawyer so that eventually you can become a judge, so we can take over the Supreme Court and change the law. What my dad was calling people to do very intelligently, very articulately, along with other people, has in fact come to pass. I was in the meetings where the program was laid out. This is not another conspiracy theory. There was nobody in a back room. It was all in the open. But what the right-wing evangelical leadership, including my dad and myself, were calling people to in the late 1970s through to the mid-1980s and beyond was exactly what 40, 50 years later has exactly happened to the last detail and is happening now. And so I just want to throw that out. I want to get back to your comments, but I want you to fold in what I've just talked about there, Jared, because I don't think people understand.
No.
This was done on purpose. And I was in the room. Okay. So I am not lying to you.
And Frank, I want to point out, and I'm so glad that you talk about this, and I'm going to have you on my podcast so we can talk about this so far in depth, because people don't get this. You even see it in the coverage of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They treat it as if it was a spontaneous outburst of political energy.
Right.
Like all of a sudden people woke up one day and they're like, we have to stop abortion. And that's not at all what this is.
Not at all. And I was there when we argued with evangelical leaders who would tell Dad, as Billy Graham did in a room in the Mayo Clinic, with me sitting there, Dad was in bed getting chemotherapy. Billy came to visit him because he was across the street. And Dad said, I beg you to get involved with our cause, Billy. That's the pro-life cause. And Billy said, no, I cannot. I believe that a woman has a right to terminate a pregnancy. Actual words, exact quote. I was in the room. Same thing with Dr. Criswell. Evangelicals, far from this being a slam dunk, had to be talked into joining the radical right-wing wing of the Roman Catholic Church, where the people themselves were more divided. And people don't get that. The first fight was within evangelicalism to conquer it for this ideology.
Right. And by the way, to take this, we were just talking about the difference between conventional stories, easy narratives, and harder stories. What you're telling is a much larger story that has so much more intricate underpinnings to it. So for instance, what you're talking about is creating a political project that has a ton of reasons behind it, right? It's not the idea that it's fighting evil or Satan's hurting America, which, by the way, is what the modern right is telling people, much like every other iteration of the right does, which is America is suffering. America is in decline because it has offended God. And God has taken away his favor. And the way that you fix that is you get rid of abortion, you reinstall gender norms, all, you name it, right? You have to please God. And in a way, and I hate to say it this way, but it's true. It's the exact same thing that pre-Christian societies were doing when they had to have sacrifices to gods.
Yeah.
They said, we need our crops, so we need to sacrifice people to please the god. It's a superstitious explanation of things. So when you actually get into the material reasons for this, the project that you're talking about is being carried out for political power. It's been an appeal to bring in the evangelicals and create voting bases and to keep getting these Supreme Court justices put in place, who, by the way, aren't just there to get rid of abortion. They're there to roll back the regulatory state, to get rid of the ability for the federal government to regulate businesses.
Or guns, or regulate guns.
And that's a whole different conversation.
I know, but it's part of the anti-regulatory regime.
And the reason why Roe v. Wade was overturned now is not because necessarily that they took the court. That is true. But there's a couple of things that happened here. One, the Republican Party is historically unpopular. They're not going to win any more elections unless they fix elections, which is coming. That's on the docket right now. And all that's happening in the states and preparing the line. Right. There's a second part to this, and that is America looked up in the past couple of years and they suddenly realized, oh my God, our population is in decline. And more importantly to these people, the white population is in decline and they're in trouble of being overtaken by minorities, which is why you keep hearing about great replacement theory, white replacement theory, all of this. So it's not an accident that this is and by the way, our economy, it's not going to have enough consumers in the future. You're not going to have enough people to work the jobs. And on top of that, if we're going to reindustrialize, you're going to have a lot of people in those factories who are going to need to work for bare bone wages. You have a point here where the religious ideology that you're talking about, they don't believe in the religious ideas. Some do. But the people who are carrying this out, some are true believers, some of them see it as useful. They are doing this for political, economic purposes. And they also want to win elections. They want to control women. They want to create a theocratic state. But all of that is in service of a larger who has power and who doesn't have power. And right now we're seeing the progress of the 20th century rolled back so that old hierarchical power can use Christianity, evangelical narratives, you name it, to solidify their power over a system and get rid of liberal democracy once and for all.
Let's get back to the minor point, but personal curiosity of the difference. Now,
the spectrum.
What you just said, I think, is part of it, because I think one of the mistakes I make is to look too closely at the narrative through my own bubble, which is my personal history of the sort of right-left divide, where I think you bring something that's really necessary and enlightening to me and will help me think through these things and articulate them better, is this idea that there's a wider narrative over and above even the narrative I'm stuck in.
Yeah,
because beyond the right-left divide, beyond the evangelical theocracy movement, which is real, and Amy Coney Barrett, if I may say so, is a glassy-eyed devotee of the real deal. Yes. As was our last attorney general with Trump. You know, he was the real deal. He's a conservative Roman Catholic who went off and gave
Bill Barr literally said that the rule of law was based on the Christian religion.
And he believes it.
And he believes it.
And you can bet Bill Barr and Amy Coney have both read my dad's books. I know that Virginia Roberts has, because she talks about that. Anyway,
if you haven't read, by the way, Bill Barr's speech, I believe it was at Notre Dame.
I read it, and in fact, I responded to it at length on all sorts of things going on. Ranting
how should we then live
into a void that no one was listening to? But there we are. I got it.
There during the BLM protest, and I recommend everybody check this out.
Yeah,
Bill Barr's response to the Black Lives Matter protest movement was, "How should we then live?"
Yeah,
it was the idea.
Page for page borrowed.
It absolutely was.
He even used the same terminology.
Yes, he absolutely did. And he started talking about, I mean, I'm sorry, but when all of a sudden you start talking about postmodernism in your speeches.
How Should We Then Live, by the way, is the book my father wrote, upon which I based a film series that we spent millions of dollars making, that every evangelical in the world back in your time, Jared,
incredible propaganda that scared the hell out of me.
Yeah,
I'll tell you that as a kid. But so to go along with this idea of the political spectrum, I want to make very clear a couple of things. One, the left, whatever we want to call the left, is not historically what we think about the left. Whenever all of a sudden they're talking about Marxists and socialists, there is no Marxist movement. There's no socialist movement. Those have been absolutely destroyed. And as organized labor was dismantled, you had leftist movements around the world that were intentionally destroyed. And in America, by the FBI, the CIA, you name it. That was intentional. There is no quote unquote left that has any power. If you want to talk about center left, we can start talking about democratic socialism, something along those lines. But when people talk about the left in this country, what they're actually talking about are out of context academic conversations, like critical race theory, gender ideology, you name it. Those are conversations that are taking place in academic spaces, basically to trouble ideas and to figure out new sort of places. The right has weaponized those things in incredible ways, because once academic conversations leave the academy, to people who don't understand them, they're terrifying.
Yeah, it's like hearing a little bit of conversation from an oncology department at Mass General, and then you come out and you found a cure. You know, you're making wild
So as we're sitting here talking about like gender identity, right? Scientists have known, psychologists have known, sexual gender theorists have known for decades that these gender ideas that we have are not natural. There are natural elements. There's a difference between sex and gender. But when that all of a sudden ends up with my family or with my community who haven't taken those classes, who don't understand the context of it, they hear it and they think they're coming after my children. They're going to change my children. They're going to do this.
As a little footnote that I'll just feed into it. And by the way, I want to go to a much better question in a second.
Oh, but I have a bigger point I want to make on this. But yes.
Don't let me forget to ask you to go a little deeper on Ginny Thomas and where all that's coming from.
Absolutely.
We'll get back to that. So dive in. Sorry.
So real fast, going back to that coast divide that we're talking about, the East Coast, West Coast, and then the center of America.
Right.
It's important to point out that as the center of America was hollowed out, as people like my family were more or less being abandoned, and that is true. You know, people want to roll their eyes about economic anxiety. It's real. Like that's an actual real reason behind a lot of this.
Yes.
All of our culture comes from the East and the West Coast. These are the people who have national news. These are the people who have national entertainment. They have the corporations, all of this. Their ideas are playing out in our media. And the right has figured out, the Republicans have figured out, Fox News has figured out that if they take that and if they enlarge it and they say, oh, here's a series on Netflix, here's a commercial, whatever, Mr. Potato Head, Dr. Seuss, all this stuff, they have figured out that terrifies the people in the middle because that's not their culture. Their culture from the coast are being beamed in over them as
strategically beamed in to rile up the masses, but also just to raise money as well, and the whole bit.
Right. And so what we're actually talking about is a difference between Republican right-wing control of power. They actually do have control because they control the economics, they control the political situation, versus perceived power, right? So as we're watching movies in which, you know, people are coming out as transgender, or, you know, and for some of these communities, even seeing like a interracial couple terrifies them. You know what I mean? As they're seeing that narrative that their world is being taken away seems more and more pressing.
Well, to the point, just to back up what you're saying and say, Jared's right. You know, to give you the praise of your opposites here, you know, you have people like DeSantis and so forth that understand it so well that he attacks the Disney Corporation in his own state when they are a major breadwinner for the whole state, knowing that it's a winning proposition to do exactly what you're talking about.
And by the way, nobody, literally not a single entity besides maybe the evangelical church, and you're familiar with this, has done more to push conservative, reactionary mythologies and ideas than the Disney company.
Right.
And the Disney company is not a radical woke corporation. They
Right.
have meetings in boardrooms where they say, okay, here's a cultural issue. Where does the money lie? You know, what should we support? It's the same thing with like a Nike. Nike doesn't care about BLM. They have sweatshops all around the world, right? These corporations are creating a false sense of ideology.
Well, and it's sort of a greenwashing, but on a vast scale. And the same thing goes for gender equity with American corporate values.
100%.
It's the whole thing. It's all one package.
And in a lot of ways, the things that conservatives are most afraid of at this point is the posturing by corporations. The corporations have to push a lot of these things. So like, for instance, you take, and talking about narratives, mythologies, ideologies, the Avengers franchise. The Avengers franchise is a new religion of the 21st century. It's the idea, the embodiment of America, arms manufacturers, an Aryan god, the embodiment of the nuclear bomb, whatever, you name it. That's keeping us safe. Meanwhile, Disney, in making these, knows that there will be a backlash if they don't do a hat tip to cultural liberalism or progressivism. So they have to like strategize where to like make gestures. And so the right then sees that and says, your way of life is under attack. Look at what's happening. These corporations don't care about you. They don't care about wokeness. They don't care about any of this stuff.
Right.
It is a it's like professional wrestling is what it is. It's two people pretending not to like each other and gaining benefits from it. And so this idea of the left doesn't even actually exist.
So let me stop you there for a minute and just say, okay, you know, if I'm hearing you right, what does exist is a power play by corporations to stay in business and basically let their HR departments, human resources, do whatever needs to be done to make it look like they are respectable to both sides at any given moment, but the bottom line is still profit.
There is a reason, by the way, that corporations almost to an entity all have anti-racist training, that they have these lectures. They bring those
diversity, endless diversity, something.
And that doesn't mean that hiring people to these positions isn't a good thing, but the appearance is public relations.
Of course it is.
Saying we're not sexist, we're not racist, please do not boycott our business.
Right.
That's what it's actually about.
Okay, so how do you see the interface? And then I want to get to Ginny Thomas in a moment, but how do you see the interface between this structure, this corporate structure, and the bottom line for them? We've talked a little about the new tech billionaires, who, by the way, sold themselves as saviors. In addition, it wasn't just, I mean, very much like the railroad barons. Again, we're going to join coast to coast and make America one great nation. We're going to save the country and eradicate whatever's left of the Native American population on the way and shoot their buffaloes from train windows, whatever it might be. You know, Elon Musk and these other guys, Facebook, they sold themselves as saviors of America through their tech. And then they turn around and become part of the problem, or even more so. But what's the relationship between the political parties and the corporations now, given that the corporations have essentially bought the political parties? How do you see that? Because that's another, you touched on it, but just how do you see it?
Well, again, real fast, in terms of like the messiah of big tech, this whole Elon Musk getting us to Mars thing is a religious narrative.
Right.
It's the idea, don't worry about climate change, don't cut down on what I'm doing, don't take my wealth, and I'll get you to heaven.
And also I'll through my efforts, the human species will survive. We will double.
And by the way, it literally is a recasting of the feudalist notion of Christianity, which is, listen, your lives are going to suck. You're never going to have anything good. There's no advancement. But guess what? If you're good and you obey, heaven's waiting on you. And right now, people like Musk are pushing a techno-feudalism that says, if you're good, you obey, you might make it to the heavenly kingdom of Mars. It's just a new version of that. So to go along with what you're saying, I want to point out that as Roe v. Wade has been overturned, you'll notice that all of the corporations who were quote unquote woke, they're not protesting the decision. They're not like threatening to leave the states that they're in. And why? Because the red states don't charge them as many taxes. They don't have to pay as much. The regulations are less. They're not threatening to leave. They're threatening to pay to have women go across to other states and pay for their abortions. This is important Because in our current state, we have been taught, don't expect the government to help you. They'll let you die in Katrina. They'll let you die in a winter storm in Texas. They can't do anything. Corporations are where change can be had. And now the corporations are going to welcome this. And they're going to welcome this authoritarian march, everything that we're talking about, because they don't care about democracy. In fact, democracy is really dangerous to the business environment that they prefer. And as we've seen over and over with fascism, Nazism, you name it, we keep seeing that these people, when the rubber hits the road, they support this. They're all for it because, again, going back to what we said, it's the executive mindset. They want somebody to get in there and have uncontestable power who works with them. So they are absolutely moving in that direction. And it's almost fated that they would. I mean, of course they would. That's what a corporation is for.
Let's snap back here a second. We talked about true believers. I think Ginny Thomas is one of them. Her husband probably is too. We know that Barr was. We surmise that Amy Coney Barrett is one. You know, glassy-eyed true believers. They're sincere. How does their narrative of genuinely working towards a theocracy to quell secular humanism, as they would call it, and replace it with a return to biblical absolutes, which is the way my father pitched it. And of course, that brings up a subject about American history. Are they really returning? Or are they creating something new? Because America never quite was the Christian country they talk about. But how does their narrative and the corporate narrative you're talking about interface? And who's using whom? Because you know, Amy Coney Barrett is no fool, and I'll bet you, if she's listening to this conversation someday, which I'd say, you know, like Jeeves, the contingency is remote. Okay, but that said, how do those two movements or groups of people who truly believe what they're saying? Because I'm sure Elon Musk is sincere. He really sees himself as a messiah figure, and so do the people who work at the top of Facebook and so forth. How do these religious visions? As you were talking about Musk, it's a religious vision. They watched Star Trek when they were teenagers. They want to do this. They're going to save the human race. They're all going to be, you know, Jean-Luc Picard at some point. So, how do these two religions interface? Who's using whom? How do you see that?
Well, I think they're both.
Okay, let me just say it one more time. In essence, we have two theocracy movements that are both in tandem, helping each other and competing. One is a biblically based narrative of the theology you and I were raised on, made political and vicious. The other is a secular narrative, a kind of an Elon Muskism, you know, of repopulating the world with the right kind of people and building these cars and a fortune and off you go, and or linking everybody together in this kind of glassy-eyed Facebook version of the world. So we got two religious narratives competing. I don't think people have thought about this. I certainly haven't thought about it as much as you have. I want to ask you how you think these narratives, how does Ginny Thomas interface with Elon Musk, and where do their paths travel together to the detriment of all the rest of us?
So I think it's really important to understand, when it comes to ideology and personal narratives, how those things overlap. So for instance, you know, I grew up poor. Right? I grew up incredibly, incredibly poor. So when I interacted with Christianity, it was the idea of the meek will inherit the earth, or God is shining down on you, or at least you're part of the greatest country in the world and you're doing your part. I think there is a generational and class problem that's taking place. I'll be frank, I think the boomer generation is freaking out here in, you know, sort of the twilight years. And I think a lot of these people, someone like a Ginny Thomas, who has had incredible privilege, incredible wealth, incredible power. One of the things that religion does is it says, hey, you do deserve these things. You've been chosen by God, and look at this system that God has provided and shined light on. And now these people over here who they believe are evil, because it's always important to think that you are on the side of good, which means that your enemies are on the side of evil. And even if you go back to St. Augustine, the idea of righteous oppression. And this is an interesting thing with Augustine. Augustine said, if you oppress the church, we're on the good side. That's bad oppression. If we're the church and we oppress people, that's necessary, right? So you have people like Thomas and Barr and Pompeo. They look at their lives as God smiling on them. And as a result, they need to defend the system from the evil that would overthrow it. It's a satanic conspiracy that would possibly do it. The big tech, Silicon Valley corporate philosophy is a different shade of that. And people always think that it's leftist. It's not. It's actually a weird amalgamation of what we would call New Age ideology, but Ayn Randian philosophy.
Yeah.
It's the idea that you are a master of the universe and that your wealth and your success is proof that you are more worthy than other people.
Well, not only that, the little people in the Ayn Randian mold, they're trying to keep you down.
Exactly.
And they are deserving only of the scraps from your table.
And by the way,
you're the big man.
And I want to point out in both of these cases, the interlocking idea is it's not just that other people have opposite opinions. It's an apocalyptic notion. If they stand in my way, if the masses stand in my way, if the government stands in my way, there will be an apocalypse.
Yeah.
Things will fall apart. And apocalyptic narratives are, and this is one of the things I discovered writing Midnight Kingdom, they're incredibly powerful.
And are you saying there, let me just stop you there a minute. Are you saying the apocalyptic vision is similar, though different, on both, or both sides?
They're the exact same.
They both have apocalyptic visions.
Yes, they both have apocalyptic visions. On one hand, the evangelicals believe in an actual apocalypse.
Actual apocalypse, yeah.
Giving Satan too much power over the earthly domain will, trigger the end times battle, and possibly Satan could win. Right. Which, by the way, is like an insane, like twisted biblical interpretation.
Yeah. God needs us to get history right, because although God is all powerful still, you never know. We have to do our part.
It's important.
For a start, Jesus can't come back unless we help him fulfill certain conditions.
And by the way, it's an important thing. And this was a universe altering idea that I finally came around, which is God is the lens through which we make sense of ourselves.
Yeah.
And what we do and how we navigate the world, our identity and the stories we tell. Over on the tech side, and I want to make this clear, and I want people to walk away with this, they literally believe they're living gods. They literally believe that they not only have reached the top of the economic and political food chain, but that by doing so and by tinkering with these new technologies, they are more or less new messiahs of a new age, and that they are being persecuted by being taxed, by being held back by democracy and elections.
Speaking of which, when you look at the movie Don't Look Up, and the tech genius in that movie, he talks about him. He says, "You're a businessman." He says, "I'm not a businessman. I'm evolution."
Right. They literally believe that they are the embodiment of the will of the universe. And that interlocking of religious ideologies, they find each other so well.
Well, and they believe they are the key to the survival of the human race.
That's right. And if you actually spend time looking at their ideology, and this is deep in the weeds stuff, they literally are convinced that if they do the right things, they will never die. We're talking about actual immortality, unlocking the secrets of the universe, recognizing in themselves a godlike power. And real quick, and this is an aside, but this should drive it home. When Christopher Columbus, discovered, when he came to North America and conquered North America and enslaved the indigenous people, he literally promoted himself as the herald of a new revelation. He believed he was a messiah who had been chosen by God to unlock this new world. There is a direct correlation between that ideology and Elon Musk wanting to get us to Mars.
Right.
It is the exact same religious apocalyptic framework. And when they find each other, they find agreement on this, which is the capitalist system they inhabit favors them. And that's God's favor, the universe's favor. And on top of that, the masses are out to hurt them. And they have to figure out some way. That's why all of these forces are coming together.
They all hate any agency like the SEC that even deigns to talk to them about regulation.
Well, because those things are put in place to help the lesser people. They're basically handicapping what they're capable of doing. Right. And that this is actually a giant crime. This is why all of them believe that liberal democracy is one of the worst mistakes that has ever happened. They want instituted hierarchical power, unquestioned hierarchical power. And that is what all these people are going for, which is why when you look at January 6th, when you look at the Republican Party, you look at the Supreme Court, you can't just look at the people who are on your TV screens. You need to look at the donors. You need to look at the people who are paying the money and who are pulling the strings, because all of this is a consolidated effort. It's a team effort to take down liberal democracy.
Okay, so the people paying the money at that point, let's talk about the Mercers, the Kochs, et cetera. This new class of billionaire, as I see it, at least for January 6th, to my understanding, they're sort of hovering. But when it comes to their own version of the insurrection, which will probably be a little smoother and not use the, the same types of people, it won't be done so much in Jesus's name. Let's double back and just say again, using her now as a kind of a symbol, where does the footpath of Ginny Thomas, Amy Coney Barrett, and Barr, where do they converge with the Elon Musk's religion of self-aggrandizement and godlike status? Because at some point, these two forces are either going to be in opposition or they're going to travel together. And right now, it seems to me they're traveling together somewhat, if however unintentionally. How do you see that? Because the theocracy movement in America and the evangelical circles is really real. Their idea, is not to return America to a place where it can make Elon Musk more prosperous. But Elon Musk has a different agenda, and yet they seem to be on the same side of so many issues in terms of how it's the result for democracy.
Yeah. Well, the opposition comes from that idea that, it's a fascist idea. It's might makes right. Right. And if you actually look at this, I know everybody is very, very fond of turning to, the Handmaid's Tale. They're always saying we're heading towards the Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale, I think, actually is a very tame version of what we're heading toward. Because, if you actually have ever read Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, it's about surveillance and about word of mouth. We're talking about the type of surveillance created by these people. And by the way, big tech, this isn't well covered in our media. They constantly go to authoritarian countries such as China and say, how do we help? How do we help? They've cut their teeth on that. So as a result, and by the way, all of those things are coming back around to America. All of this technology, all of these systems are being put in place. And to really bring this home, I don't know if people know this, there are algorithms that can know that you're pregnant before you do. Like they literally look at your actions and your activities, and they're like, that person's pregnant like weeks before you even know it. This is a system that these two parts are going to come together on. They will institute it simply because they look at it and they understand they have a common enemy. And the common enemy is liberal democracy or mass democracy. And so that ideology, it's not just apocalyptic, it's also revelatory. It's the difference between thinking the universe has told me what I need to do and now I need to do it at all cost, versus, hey, I think other people have decent ideas. Maybe we need a collaborative, healthy environment. And that religious idea is exactly where these things cross. It is how you view the world and how you view your place in the world, and whether you should be on top of it or whether or not you should be a part of it.
Do you think, looking forward, there is anything, just to change subjects here a little bit, no, not change subjects, to go a little further with this subject but in a slightly different way, do you think that there is anything realistic, without just sort of happy clappy, we have to have some hope here? Do you think we're on a trajectory where anybody can do anything? Your average person working for Facebook or Amazon, or building a Tesla car somewhere, or for that matter, manufacturing for Smith & Wesson and making semi-automatic weapons for the next serial killer, who's the next mass shooter. When you get a little lower down the food chain in these companies, and a little lower down the food chain just in our democracy, what can anybody do, to win the next election for whatever's left of the Democratic Party that's not totally co-opted? And on the other hand, slow down this kind of twin theocracy movement that I think is so interesting, the way you put it together, of the self-aggrandizing gods of the tech industry who see themselves as gods, or the remaining evangelical boomers like the Ginny Thomases who are clinging to power. Can we slow down and reverse this, or are we done?
Well, real fast on the Ginny Thomas versus the tech idea, I want to point out that all that's missing is one step. The tech people believe they're gods. people like Jenny Thomas are afraid to admit that they think they're gods, and so they think that God is on their side. It's just one divide.
Yeah.
Right. I do want to say this, and listen, I've been called a prophet of doom. I get that. I understand that these aren't fun conversations. I remain hopeful. I think right now, this current political climate, it feels a certain way because, and listen, the presidency has been pretty much depowered at this point. Like the federal level of government has been intentionally depowered by the people we're talking about.
Do you remain hopeful because of hindsight of America has been in a fix before and we dug our way out? Or do you remain hopeful based on some sort of objective observation about where things could go?
Both.
Because if both political parties are bought and paid for, how do we remain hopeful?
I'll say on that front, in terms of both political parties being owned, the industrial age, particularly with robber barons, we faced a moment like that where everybody looked up and they said, there's no way we could ever escape that. That's when the progressive movement built up from the ground up, grassroots, basically, to challenge the system. Same thing with civil rights. It did not look like civil rights was going to get done. And then you had, of course, a grassroots movement. History shows us there are these moments where it doesn't look like anything could possibly ever change. There's no hope, like it's all done. And then, I'm sorry, but the human species is pretty incredible.
Right.
I mean, if you really look, you want to get back into the history of it. And this is, again, the Midnight Kingdom, the research I did for it. If you actually look back at the feudal age, the Dark Ages, like all information and all power was concentrated away from the people. I mean, one of the most oppressive systems imaginable. We escaped that. We actually got out of it and at least had a glimmer of hope after that. I will say that the president, particularly right now, Joe Biden, and listen, I voted for him against Donald Trump. If it was Biden and Trump again, I'd vote for Biden again. Do not get me wrong. He's not the right man for the right time. And there is no overarching vision or alternative story. He can't explain to people why his agenda can't get done. He can't explain what the crisis is about. And on top of that, and this is going back to like an FDR or some of the major presidents, he doesn't have a story for the future. There's no story of what an alternative would look like. The only alternative that's being pushed in the major political sphere at this point is national conservatism and the rolling back of, progress of the 20th century. That's where the momentum is right now.
Yeah.
I see potential in us having conversations like this. I see potential in these labor unions that are being formed, in people starting to piece together things. My concern is this. Do we live in a selfish enough, self-involved culture to the point where people are more interested in entertaining themselves and pursuing their own profits and power, which is what the system tells them to do?
And also, by the way, by doing that, we are enriching the tech gods without end. Because as long as every 13-year-old's given an iPhone and then gets on whatever the next thing is, they got them. And then, all my liberal buddies are driving Teslas so that they don't pollute the environment. Elon's got them. So I'm so glad that you said that, because an entire industry has been set up to make money off of telling people you're doing your part. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. One of the reasons I appreciate you, and one of the reasons why I appreciate us having this conversation, is this. All of this chaos and all of these crises, they're incredibly good for content. They're great for ratings. They're great for clicks. They're great for selling books. You name it. Yeah. There's a difference between talking about this stuff and dealing with this stuff in a commodified way, right? By the way, and that's what social media is. Yeah. Twitter, if you don't use it the right way, is about literally venting your frustrations and turning them into a product. When we have a conversation, we're talking about how to actually make the world better, which is the important thing, right? We have to go out in the streets. We have to put together a movement. We have to start to recognize each other. And what I say to people is this, and as a reformed evangelical, we have to develop faith. Only faith can replace faith. And the only faith I think that can actually lead us out of this is a faith in each other, is a faith that, you're not trying to screw me. I'm not trying to screw you. When the rubber hits the road, we'll be there together. When I need to take a break, you'll pick me up. When you need a break, I'll pick you up. That we're not going to be co-opted, that we're not going to get picked off by these people who, by the way, are absolute experts
at picking
us off. Yeah.
At picking us off. If we can return to that type of a faith, I actually think there is a hope for a much better future. But it's not going to be easy, and we're not going to get there simply voting or watching this stuff on TV or retweeting tweets. It has to be an actual people-led grassroots movement.
And just to follow that through, it seems to me that grassroots movement also has to have some sort of realistic aim,
yes,
to undo in some way the power of our tech gods, yes, and also reform our political system. Yes, and I just don't understand how that happens. In other words, how do we tax the billionaire class into a rightful position of paying their dues? How do we do all this? Well, how do we expose the fact that it's not good to have billionaire gods in your presence who owe no one anything or think they don't?
So on that note, I think this is important. You and I and we haven't talked about this, but undoubtedly, you know, people who have fallen into MAGA, QAnon, sure, all of that, right? When I talk to people in my life who have fallen for Trump, who have fallen for QAnon, MAGA, you name it, first of all, they're going through a hard time. You know what I mean? Their lives are falling apart. They're suffering some sort of existential personal crisis. These
sure, things
are a new faith. Basically, it's like, well, Donald Trump's a terrible president or whatever, but I have faith that he's working behind the scenes. There's a plan. You know, that sounds familiar. When you talk to those people, and we've been having a large conversation about this whole thing. When I talk to those people, I'm supposed to be their political enemy. They're not supposed to trust me. They're supposed to believe that I'm part of the deep state. But when I talk to them and I say, guess what? I don't trust the Democratic Party either. And here is the top-down situation as opposed to left, right, Republican, red. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When you have that conversation, you change the paradigm. Everyone knows it's a top-down problem. Yes. And when you have those conversations, even people who paper their trucks in Trump stickers and wear a MAGA hat everywhere they go, they'll admit that they know deep down that Donald Trump isn't actually fighting for them. It's an identity. It's a faith. It's an orthodoxy for them. When we start having conversations about someone like an Elon Musk, I want to point out a couple of weeks ago, as it came out that all these impropriety allegations were coming out, he immediately was like, I'm going to be a Republican. And when he said, I'm going to be a Republican, the Republicans came to help him. And it's a bunch of people who are being held down by people like him, who are suffering because of people like him. If you get rid of that paradigm and you start talking top down, all of a sudden you can have conversations about getting money out of politics. You can have conversations about common sense reform. You can start having all these discussions that don't involve Democratic versus Republican. And that, I think, is one of the cures for this spell, is having actual deeper political conversations as opposed to just reciting headlines to one another.
Yeah, I love that point. I would like to continue this, and we will have, I hope, another conversation
for sure
as soon as possible. In the meantime, I think we will serve this particular conversation best if I wrap it up, only because then it makes it more available. But Jared, would you please keep talking with me? And, you know, if you in your travels and your speaking and your reading can think of a couple other people that you would like to have on, that you would like to talk to in this context, let me be the host of a conversation you want to have, please get in touch with my producer, Ernie, and say, Ernie, Professor so-and-so somewhere, or my uncle, Tom, who always worked in a factory, whatever, is someone you need to be talking with in this context. Then show back up again with any guests or guests you want to bring and any subject you want to talk about, because I think that it's important that people hear what you have to say. If you would do that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. And we need to get you on the Muckrake Podcast here soon.
Whatever. I want to do that. And the other thing is, let me tell everybody watching, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My latest book is Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. You've seen the poster behind me. And it's, as they say, in bookstores everywhere, which means it's on Amazon. And we will have Jared back again. And meanwhile, if you want to get in touch with Jared, or you want to read the two books, one which is out, one which is coming out, let me get the title straight again. I always mangle everything, so I'm going to read them because I'm a terminal dyslexic for real. So one is out, which is American Rule, The Man They Wanted Me to Be. And the one that's coming out is The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and and the coming crisis. If you want to get in touch with Jared, if you want to read the books, we're going to put links to everything he's ever touched in his life on this podcast, wherever it appears. So you don't have to jot anything down. You just click buttons and you'll be there. And Jared, please come back. Let's talk more. And also, if you think of some people, will you please let Ernie know and say, Ernie, you need to have so-and-so on, because I know that whoever you think we should be talking to, we should be talking to, and bring them back with you, and or just send us, introduce us.
For sure.
This has been great. Thanks, Jared. Talk soon.